The journey of the scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse. Being the scapegoat in a narcissistic family is to be saddled with all the narcissistic parent's problems and essentially sent into exile. The scapegoat child has to keep finding ways to hold on to the narcissistic parent in the face of this rejection or exile. And usually that's done by the child believing things about themselves that let them perceive the narcissistic parent's abuse as something the child deserves. These are the kinds of beliefs I've covered in other videos and on the blog post on my website. And the beliefs, for example, include, if I'm not being productive, then I'm worthless. Or I don't deserve protection. Or I am defective. Or I am unattractive. Or I am always one mistake away from complete ruin. At some point, the scapegoat survivor faces a choice of whether to keep living life according to these beliefs or to see if there's a more compassionate and meaningful way to treat oneself. Scapegoat survivors who are seeking to heal have come to question the ways their narcissistic abuser treated them. They particularly question whether or not they deserve such mistreatment as the narcissistic abuser claimed. Getting to this point of questioning the narcissistic abuser is something that every survivor, I think, does for him or herself. But then the question often becomes what to do next. In today's video, I'm going to describe in depth the scapegoat's journey from being saddled with the burdens of the narcissist's own self-hatred, to questioning that hatred and whether it belongs to them, to connecting back to a home within themselves that wasn't safe to occupy when serving as the scapegoat to the narcissistic abuser. But first, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California who specializes in helping scapegoat survivors complete this journey in their own lives. And I like to think of therapy and my online course as ways to afford each survivor a map of this journey so that they can know the best path to take for themselves. Of course, each survivor must travel this path for themselves, but a map can be tremendously important to do this with. And I think there are 3 features on this map that I call the 3 pillars to recovery. The first pillar is making sense of what happened so that you know it wasn't your fault. The second pillar is gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, whether that's psychological, emotional, or physical distance. And the third pillar is living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And relatedly, it's important to find and participate in communities of people who can get you, validate you, and support you as you find your way on this map. And that's where the accompanying private Facebook group comes in with the online course. Today's video addresses all 3 of these pillars of recovery. And you can learn more about this online course by finding the link in the description box below or by clicking here. And if you were a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or partner, I'd also encourage you to check out my free ebook on this topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as a Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoated child or partner of the narcissistic abuser. You know, whether it's the self-limiting beliefs I mentioned earlier, that you need to adopt in order to survive, or just understanding why the narcissistic personality is so geared to put those who are closest to them down and make them feel less than. Well, I think along with today's video, this ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but was rather the product of the narcissistic abuser's own psychological pathology. You can also find the link to that ebook in the description box below or by clicking here. So how does the journey of the scapegoat begin? Well, the term scapegoat comes from a religious scholar's attempt to describe 2 rituals that Jewish people performed with goats in the Old Testament in preparation for the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur. One of the goats, actual animal goats, was simply slaughtered, but the other goat was for the members of the community to pin their sins upon that goat and then cast that goat into exile in a rocky headland that was away from the village. The second goat, who was sent out in that manner, is what became known as the scapegoat. And I think the notion of sin is a good one to understand the experience of the child marked as the scapegoat by the narcissistic family. Most scapegoat survivors have an indelible and long-held sense that they are somehow guilty, dirty, bad, undeserving of leniency, and incapable of innocence. It's like they feel they are full of original sin, while those around them are blameless, superior, innocent, and much more deserving than the scapegoated child. So when the scapegoat child is cast as the sinner, then the rest of the family gets to be cast as the saints. Of course, there's a manipulation of reality going on. The scapegoat is not really to blame for everyone else's sins, but that's what the majority in the family insists upon. The scapegoat child, who is in the critical period of developing their sense of identity in the world, is at a dramatic disadvantage in fighting against this lie. That child needs his family to tell him or her who the child is in the world, lest he feel like he is no one to nobody. So the child finds a way to convince himself that his family is right about how bad he is, and thus the child can now perform the function needed by the narcissistic parent and the family, that the child sees himself as deserving of their sins so that they may live as saints, the other family members. And the one need it kind of meets for the child is that the child has a frame of reference for who he is. He's not left with no frame of reference, which would happen if the child insisted on his own inner goodness. Well, in contrast to the origin story of the term scapegoat, so long as the narcissistic family is around, they typically don't cast the scapegoat child into exile because they need that child. What typically happens is that the scapegoat child finds ways of his or her own to get some distance from the family as the child grows up. You know, whether that takes the form of like going on Reddit to read the thread or the subreddit called Raised by Narcissist, or YouTube to find channels like this, or confiding with a friend about what life's really like at home, or moving out of the home to go to work or to go to college. The scapegoat child might secure for themselves kind of their own exile at one point or another in their lives. And I find that it's at that point that the scapegoat survivor may find themselves in that sort of rocky headland that the original scapegoat found itself after being exiled from the village. And so kind of like in your mind's eye, you can sort of imagine whether it's yourself or, an individual in this situation kind of being out there, in that rocky headland. And at that moment or that point, the scapegoat survivor has the room to entertain a very important and needed existential crisis. That in order to play the role of scapegoat to his narcissistic parent, the survivor in essence has had to believe that there's nothing good about themselves and everything is good about that narcissistic parent, or maybe more generally now, other people. Yet as the scapegoat survivor goes about living in the world away from the narcissistic family, the survivor's got to do something with likely accumulating evidence in their world today that they're not as bad as they've been forced to believe, and maybe even forced themselves to believe. That they may also wrestle with a growing desire in themselves to exist in a way that may not feel so wretched. And it's in these moments that I think the scapegoat survivor faces and makes a really important choice. The first option is to go on believing they deserve the feeling of sin that they've carried around all this time. The second option is to begin questioning why they were burdened with this feeling of sin in the first place and start the quest for the truth. And this is the moment I alluded to at the start of the video. I suspect that if you survived narcissistic abuse as a scapegoat and you're watching this, then you may have already taken that second option. And now the question becomes, what's next? After questioning whether you're really as bad as you've been made to feel for so long, what now? Well, now the scapegoat survivor is in a particular position. They're in the rocky headlands of life that they found exile in, and they're saddled with this well-worn sense of who they are that does not serve them in this situation. This familiar sense of who they are, riddled with convictions that they're defective and undeserving in a myriad of ways. And what has worked in managing the terrible feelings that come along with this familiar sense of who they are is to get away. Get away from themselves by paying more attention to others than themselves. Get away from others because the attention from others has maybe grown to feel bad rather than good. Well, in order for the scapegoat to get back to the only home that is truly available to them, they must learn to override this long practiced reflex of getting away from themselves and others with the new practice of getting closer to themselves and to safe others. And this is not done in one fell swoop or even a few fell swoops. It is a process, and you cannot do this alone, in my very strong opinion. So the answer to the question of what's next for the scapegoat survivor who has questioned the edict that he is wretched is to find and go home. But the catch is that the home resides within the survivor's own self. And I'll submit to you right now that it can be tremendously helpful to have a map to help in finding your home within and charting your path there. So how does the scapegoat survivor learn to get closer to themselves instead of getting away? Well, I think this is the heart of what this channel and all the resources on recovery from narcissistic abuse are all about, in my opinion. And that's what the 3 pillars of recovery are all designed to do. Help you feel safer in getting closer to yourself instead of away from yourself as the only way to live. And in my personal and professional experience, there are 3 pillars that can help you set up residence inside of yourself instead of away from yourself. And these pillars really work in concert with each other and ideally would be equally balanced in their emphasis in the survivor's life. Well, the first pillar involves understanding how the feeling of being the original and only sinner in your family was artificial, no matter how convincing that feeling might be. That's what making sense of what happened is all about. Understanding the dynamics of narcissistic personality that led to you being put into the role of scapegoat with little to no say in the matter. And the second pillar is just about your immediate safety. You know, as the Rolling Stones put it in their brilliant 1969 song, Gimme Shelter, gaining distance from your narcissistic abuser in the here and now is critical. One needs shelter. The scapegoat cannot unravel this pseudo-identity while still being cast as the sinner by the powers that be. And I think this pillar is not just about demonizing the narcissistically abusive person for sport. It has a much deeper function. The scapegoat survivor was initially blamed by those around them, and in order to survive had to learn to internalize that blame as a basis of identity. And so the scapegoat had to take what was happening on the outside and make it into what was happening on the inside of themselves. And this process of getting closer to oneself really requires interrupting this practice of blame happening on the inside, but it does not stand a chance if one is still being blamed on the outside. So the noise from without has to be quieted down enough to be able to listen to oneself, begin to approach instead of avoid your inner experience, and to forge an ongoing connection to yourself on the inside. And the third pillar of recovery, again, living in defiance of the narcissist rules, involves acting out of compliance with the beliefs you needed to convince yourself of that you deserve to be the scapegoat. And this can't be done alone. It really requires finding and cultivating relationships with trusted others where the quality of those relationships make it impossible to be out of compliance with these beliefs without compromising the other's availability to you. So to defy the narcissist rule that you are undeserving would require acting as though you are deserving by, say, telling a safe friend directly what would make you happy, in the context of a relationship. Well, if you were a scapegoat survivor of narcissistic abuse, I hope that today's talk of the journey, and I think the real boldness and courage that the survivor and you may have had to exercise to get to this point where you're questioning, the ways you've been made to feel and led to believe had to be true. I hope you have found it helpful. And if you find yourself in this position, again, I would encourage you to continue to find as many resources as possible to help in your journey back to yourself, and would just submit that I think my online course can helpfully serve that function. In any case, I look forward to posting again next week, and would encourage everyone to continue posting topics in the comments section of videos you'd like to see, because I've been reading them and basing videos off them, and look forward to doing a lot more of that. Well, again, thank you for your just continued engagement with the channel, and I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.